The wind, a constant, mournful companion, sighed through the skeletal remains of the old processing mill. Its groans echoed the rustle of dry leaves caught in the rusted gears, a counterpoint to the relentless hum of my server racks. Here, at the abandoned logging camp, nestled deep within a forgotten valley, the only other sound was the distant, rhythmic drip of condensation from a perpetually leaking pipe in the auxiliary shed. It was a perfect sanctuary for my work, a place where the world forgot to intrude, and I could lose myself in the vast, silent tapestry of deep space. My name is UserIH, and for the past 7 years, this decaying monument to industry had been my home, my laboratory, my fortress against the ceaseless chatter of humanity. I'd retrofitted the old foreman's cabin into a living space, the main office into my data center, and the vast, empty sawmill floor into an antenna array shielded by the surrounding hills. My life was a meticulously curated routine of data streams, complex algorithms, and the stark, beautiful solitude of the cosmos filtered through my monitors. My specialty lay in telemetry, specifically the subtle, almost imperceptible echoes from the farthest reaches of known space. I wasn't looking for little green men. I was looking for patterns, deviations, anything that whispered of a universe more intricate than we dared imagine. And I was good at it. Exceptional, some might say, though there was no one here to say it. The evening began like any other, the chill of the valley seeping in as the sun dipped below the jagged tree line. My fingers danced across the keyboard, a blur of motion as I cycled through various filters, scrubbing terabytes of raw telemetry data for anomalies. My algorithms were designed to filter out the known, highlight the unknown. It was a largely unremarkable patch, far from any significant stellar nurseries or galactic arms. Then a blip. It was so faint, so statistically insignificant, my initial pass dismissed it as a transient error, a momentary flicker in the sensor array. Just another speck of digital dust. It wasn't the kind of error my systems typically flagged. It lacked the characteristic signature of equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. It was cleaner, too clean for noise, yet too weak to be a definitive signal. I leaned closer, my gaze fixed on the flickering waveform. My system's standard deviation calculations showed a minuscule, almost negligible deviation from the expected baseline. I reran the filter, tightening the parameters, pushing the sensitivity to its absolute limit. The blip persisted. It was a ghost, a phantom echo. My intellectual curiosity, a quiet fire that always burned beneath my solitary exterior, flared. Hours bled into each other. The wind outside picked up, rattling the loose corrugated iron on the old mill roof. I isolated the anomaly, stripping away layers of extraneous data until it stood alone. A series of minute fluctuations in the magnetic field flux, repeating at an almost imperceptible interval. It wasn't a single event, it was a sequence. Curious, I murmured, the sound of my own voice startling in the quiet. I had heard stranger things, of course. Rogue asteroids, gravitational lensing effects, even the dying gasp of a supernova thousands of light years away. But this was different. The repetition wasn't perfectly periodic like a pulsar. It was more like a stutter, a subtle, almost melodic irregularity woven into an otherwise perfect rhythm. My specialized pattern recognition algorithms, usually so decisive, struggled to categorize it. They kept spitting out a probability matrix that hovered just above random chance, a statistical limbo. I began to dive deeper, writing new scripts on the fly, tailoring my analysis specifically to this elusive stutter. I plotted the data points across multiple axes, searching for correlations, underlying harmonics, anything that could explain its persistence. The air in the data center grew thick with the smell of ozone and hot electronics. My eyes, usually so sharp, started to ache from the relentless glow of the screens. I ignored the fatigue, ignored the rumbling in my stomach. The anomaly was a puzzle, and my mind was a machine built for solving them. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in bruised purples and grays, the full scope of my discovery began to crystallize. The noise wasn't noise at all. It was a signal, undeniably, not merely repeating but evolving. The stutter wasn't random. It was a complex nested sequence, a pattern within a pattern defying all known natural phenomena. It was intricate, impossibly so, for something that had been dismissed as mere background interference. My fingers froze above the keyboard. This wasn't just a scientific curiosity anymore. This was a message. My quiet obsession had begun. The wind, that constant, mournful companion, still sighed through the skeletal remains of the old processing mill. I'd barely moved from my station in the main office building of the abandoned logging camp since the initial flicker. The anomaly. It had burrowed into my thoughts, displacing everything else. My fingers, stained with stale coffee and graphite, danced across the keyboard, a blur of motion driven by a singular, consuming purpose. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting quality of the light filtering through the grime-streaked windows and the increasingly desperate need for another lukewarm instant coffee. My world had shrunk to the glowing screens, the rhythmic pulse of the machinery, and the cold dread coiling in my gut. I was sifting through terabytes of telemetry data, raw streams from the deepest reaches, looking for it. That whisper, that impossible tremor in the static. At first, it was a ghost, a statistical aberration I could almost rationalize away as sensor noise or a processing fluke. But the more I isolated the particular frequency band, the more I focused my algorithms, the clearer it became. It wasn't random. Not in the way noise was random. This was structured. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the monitor. There, amidst the usual chaotic scatter, was a repeating sequence. Not a simple loop, but a complex, evolving pattern, like a series of interlocking fractals that shifted and rearranged themselves with an unnerving internal logic. Each iteration was subtly different, yet undeniably linked to the last, building upon itself. It wasn't a signal in the conventional sense, no clear modulation, no discernible message. It was more like a signature, a deliberately intricate arrangement of data points that defied any natural origin I knew. It was like finding a perfectly carved, impossibly intricate wooden bird amidst a pile of driftwood. The sheer improbability of it prickled the hairs on my arms. This wasn't just a discovery, it felt like an intrusion. The more I analyzed it, the more I felt its presence, not just on the screens but in the periphery of my awareness. Sleep became a distant, unwelcome memory. The few times I did succumb to exhaustion, slumping over my keyboard or collapsing onto the makeshift cot in the corner, my dreams were vivid, unsettling tapestries of impossible geometry and a pervasive sense of being watched. Sometimes, the patterns would resolve into something almost recognizable, a series of eyes, perhaps, or mouths, stretching and contracting in silent, unreadable expressions. I'd wake with a gasp, the taste of ash in my mouth, convinced I could still feel the pressure of those unseen gazes. The abandoned logging camp, once a sanctuary of isolation, began to feel like a cave. Every creak of the old timbers, every rustle of the wind through the broken windows, sounded amplified, deliberate. Was it just the building settling, or was something moving out there? Or in here with me? I started pulling the blinds, even though there was no one for miles. I checked the locks on the heavy, splintered door multiple times a night, my hand lingering on the cold metal. The logical part of my mind, the analyst I used to be, screamed that I was alone. The anomaly wasn't just data anymore. It felt like an entity, and it was reaching for me. I started to notice subtle shifts in my own perception. Colors seemed sharper, sometimes painfully so. Sounds, particularly the hum of the servers, occasionally took on a harmonic quality, as if they were trying to convey something just beyond my understanding. My focus, once a laser, now felt like a lens that could be subtly, inexplicably shifted by an outside force. I was losing track of what was real. Had I really heard a faint, rhythmic clicking from the empty main office? Or was it just the echo of the pattern repeating in my overstimulated brain? One particularly long night, as the complex pattern on my screen unfolded another impossibly intricate sequence, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass. My reflection stared back, eyes wide and bloodshot, a stranger's face. And then, for a fraction of a second, I saw it, not in the reflection but through it, as if the glass itself had become transparent to something beyond. My breath hitched. My heart, which had been a steady drum for so long, now hammered against my ribs. It wasn't just a signal, it was a gaze, and I was caught in it. The pattern wasn't just emerging from the data, it was emerging within me. I'd barely moved from my station in the main office build of the abandoned logging camp, the cold seeping into my bones, even through the layers of wool, and the intermittent warmth of the space heater. 3 days had bled into each other, marked only by the shifting light through the grime-streaked windows and the increasingly frantic pace of my code. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by a buzzing static behind my eyes, a low thrum that felt less like exhaustion and more like a resonance with the signal itself. My determination had sharpened into a brittle point. The anomaly wasn't just noise. It was an insistent, structured pattern, buried beneath layers of cosmic detritus. My algorithms had been tearing at it, stripping away the static, sifting through terabytes of data, each cycle bringing a fraction of a percent more clarity. I was operating on instinct now, my fingers flying across the keyboard, commands spitting out faster than I consciously formed them. My mind felt like a finely tuned instrument, vibrating at the edge of comprehension. Then, a flicker. Not on the main spectral analysis, but in a secondary neural network model I'd built to identify emergent complexity. It was designed to find patterns that humans wouldn't recognize as patterns, forms that defied conventional logic. A jagged line on the screen, a sudden spike in an otherwise smooth graph, then a cascade of correlated data points that had previously been dismissed as aberrations. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a pattern, it was a structure. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the cold glass of the monitor. The structure began to resolve, not as a visual image, but as a conceptual one, rendered through abstract data visualization. It was a series of overlapping, self-intersecting planes, arranged in a configuration that should be impossible. A dimension that folded back onto itself, not in a simple curve, but in a perpetual, self-consuming spiral. It was a shape that contained more space than it occupied, a volume that contradicted its own boundaries. My brain screamed in protest, trying to force it into a recognizable framework, but there was none. It defied Euclidean geometry, tore at the fabric of spatial understanding. This wasn't just information, it was an imparting. The understanding didn't come from reading a description, but from a direct, sudden download into my consciousness. I saw it, not with my eyes, but with a deeper, more fundamental part of my mind. A structure that could not exist within the universe as I knew it. And yet, here it was, undeniable, a truth revealed by raw data. A profound, sickening shift occurred within me. It wasn't just my understanding that had changed. It felt like my perception had been recalibrated. The familiar hum of the server racks suddenly sounded wrong, each whirring fan a distinct, alien thrum, overlapping in a dissonant chord. I blinked, and the worn wooden floorboards beneath my feet seemed to ripple, the grain momentarily stretching and compressing as if viewed through an impossible lens. The dusty, unlit corner of the room where a stack of forgotten lumber lay appeared to fold in on itself, becoming deeper than it should be, an infinite regressive shadow within the confines of the wall. My hands, resting on the keyboard, looked alien. The skin, the knuckles, the faint tremor, they were mine, yet they felt like props, animated by an unseen force. This wasn't just fatigue or isolation-induced hallucination. This was real. The world was subtly, terrifyingly wrong. A wave of derealization washed over me, so potent it made me gasp. There was this office, this abandoned logging camp, this world, even real, Or had the signal, in unveiling its impossible truths, fundamentally altered the very lens through which I perceived existence? My isolation, once a chosen solitude, now felt like a cage. Who could I tell? How could I explain a geometry that defied all understanding, a concept that unraveled the very notion of space and dimension? They would dismiss me, or worse, they would see the impossible truth in my eyes and condemn me for it. The wind outside howled, a mournful, drawn-out cry that seemed to mimic the internal scream of my shattered reality. I was alone, truly alone, with a knowledge that carved a chasm between me and everything I had ever known. And I had comprehended, and the world had begun to unravel. I'd barely moved from my station in the main office building of the abandoned logging camp, the data on my monitors a swirling vortex of impossible patterns. The anomaly wasn't just noise. It was a symphony, a language without words, and it was playing directly into my head. My fingers, stiff from hours of frantic input, hovered over the keyboard. I needed to tell someone, not just anyone, but someone who understood the granular intricacies of deep space telemetry, who wouldn't dismiss the data as a fever dream born of isolation. I thought of the senior researcher I'd once collaborated with on the Kepler project, a brilliant but notoriously skeptical mind. He'd appreciate the rigor, I told myself, the sheer statistical improbability of what I'd found. I drafted an email, then deleted it. Too formal, too clinical for the sickening dread that coiled in my stomach. I tried again, this time a direct message to his encrypted channel, outlining the core findings, attaching the raw data logs, the spectral analysis, the repeating non-random sequences that defied every known astrophysical model. I even included a short audio clip, a filtered version of the signal's unsettling cadence. My hands trembled as I hit send, a cold wave washing over me. The reply came less than an hour later, not from the senior researcher directly, but from his administrative assistant, a curt, pre-written dismissal. Doctor, senior researcher's role is currently engaged in critical project reviews and unable to assess unsolicited data submissions. All external inquiries regarding anomalous findings should be directed through established institutional channels for preliminary vetting. A link to a generic submission portal followed. My breath hitched. Unsolicited. Preliminary vetting. This wasn't some crackpot theory about lizard people on Mars. This was data, meticulously analyzed, verified, screaming for attention. The message felt like a physical blow, a confirmation of the chasm that had opened between me and the rest of the world. They didn't even look. They couldn't or wouldn't. The isolation, which had once felt like a necessary cocoon for my work, now felt like a tomb. A strange flicker caught my eye. Outside the window, beyond the skeletal pines, I saw a figure. A man, dressed in old-fashioned logging attire, his back to me, standing perfectly still amongst the decaying machinery of the camp. He wasn't there a moment ago. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The figure was gone, replaced by the familiar tangle of rusted metal and overgrown weeds. My heart hammered, a dull drum against my ribs. The signal, I realized with a jolt, was no longer just data. It was seeping into my perceptions, painting phantoms on the periphery of my vision. Dismissed and disoriented, I turned from the telemetry. If the scientific community wouldn't listen, perhaps history held the answers. I plunged into a different kind of research, trawling forgotten digital archives, obscure local histories, and digitized anthropological papers. I wasn't looking for space signals anymore, but for echoes of the psychological resonance I now felt. I searched for accounts of mass hysteria, inexplicable collective delusions, sudden abandonments of remote settlements, anything that hinted at a shared break from reality. Hours bled into days. The hum of the servers, the sigh of the wind, and now the insidious, almost subliminal thrum of the signal became the constant soundtrack to my descent. Not a single body found, no signs of struggle, just abandoned meals on tables and tools left mid-task. Then, a particularly obscure academic paper from the early 20th century, titled Collective Psychogenic Phenomena in Isolated Communities, caught my attention. The author, a disgraced anthropologist, theorized about non-physical atmospheric contagions that could induce widespread paranoia and shared hallucinations. Resonant frequency. It was too close. The signal wasn't just influencing me. It was a mechanism, a key that could unlock a shared delirium. I stared at the screen, the words blurring, the hum of the servers seeming to deepen, to vibrate within my very bones. Suddenly, the text on the screen began to ripple, the letters elongating, twisting into grotesque, unfamiliar glyphs. The faded photograph accompanying the paper, a sepia-toned image of Oakhaven's abandoned Main Street, shifted. The empty windows of the general store seemed to deepen, to become vast, lightless eyes, and within them I saw them. They stood perfectly still, watching, waiting. A memory flashed, not my own, but a distorted echo. I saw my own reflection in the monitor, but it wasn't me. The image flickered, then resolved back to the normal text, the photograph of Oakhaven now just a static image of desolation. But the figures, I knew, were still there, lurking in the periphery of my mind, waiting for the signal to paint them back into my reality. The shared delirium wasn't just a historical footnote. It was a live broadcast, and I was tuned in. And perhaps, I realized with a sickening lurch, I wasn't the only one. My head throbbed, a dull, resonant ache that echoed the phantom hum of servers from what felt like a lifetime ago. A raw, metallic tang filled my mouth, and the world swam into focus in a sickening lurch. I was sprawled on damp earth, a thick layer of pine needles cushioning my fall. Above me, skeletal trees clawed at a bruised, indifferent sky. Rusted machinery, hulking and silent, littered the clearing, their forms half swallowed by encroaching moss and tangled undergrowth. The air here was heavy with the scent of decay, wet wood, and something else, something sharp and acrid like old oil mixed with regret. I pushed myself up, my limbs protesting with a stiffness that felt alien. How did I get here? The last thing I remembered was the screen, the words blurring, the terrifying proximity of the signal. Then, nothing but a vast, echoing blankness. My hands, when I looked at them, seemed a shade paler, the lines on my palms unfamiliar, almost like a poorly rendered copy. I tried to recall the journey, the decision to leave, but the memories were like smoke, dissolving at the edges of my perception. There was only the overwhelming sensation of having been moved, not moving myself. A sudden gust of wind whistled through the gaps in a derelict sawmill, and for a terrifying instant it wasn't wind at all. It was a voice, low and sibilant, whispering my name. UserIH, but it wasn't my name. Not really. It was a designation, a label. My true name, the one I'd always known, felt like a forgotten melody just beyond reach. I spun around, scanning the dense tree line, the jumble of fallen logs and rusted saw blades. Nothing. Just the sway of branches, the creak of old metal. But the whisper lingered, a phantom echo in my inner ear. I started to walk, stumbling over gnarled roots, drawn by an inexplicable pull towards the heart of the abandoned logging camp. A tall, gaunt silhouette moving between two stacks of decaying lumber. A flicker of movement behind a collapsed shed, a flash of something too bright, too quick. I blinked and it was gone, replaced by the mundane reality of rot and ruin. My thoughts felt crowded, not my thoughts, not entirely. There was a current, a subtle undercurrent of intention that wasn't mine, urging me forward, guiding my gaze. Look here, UserIH, observe this. It was like having a passenger in my own mind, a silent co-pilot with an agenda I couldn't grasp. I stopped beside a towering skeletal crane, its boom reaching like a skeletal arm towards the sky. The metal was pitted with rust, a tapestry of oranges and browns, something immense. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving behind a faint, sweet smell of ozone and pine sap. Reveal/discovery. I noticed a small, deeply carved symbol on one of the crane's rusted panels, partially obscured by lichen. It wasn't just a scratch, it was deliberate, a pattern of interlocking spirals and sharp angles. As my fingers traced its contours, a memory bloomed in my mind, stark and terrifyingly clear. I saw myself not here, but in a sterile, white room, hunched over a console, my face illuminated by the glow of a screen. My hands were moving, inputting commands, my fingers flying across a keyboard. But the data on the screen wasn't telemetry. It was a complex, multi-layered projection of this very symbol, expanding, contracting, shifting. And then I saw myself smile. It was a smile of profound satisfaction, a smile of ownership. The memory was so potent, so real, yet I knew with a panicked certainty that it wasn't mine. I had never been in that room. I had never smiled like that. But the feeling of that alien satisfaction, that deep, unsettling contentment resonated within me, a ghost sensation. There was this what I desired. There was this my desire now. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt. My own past, my actual memories felt flimsy like cheap wallpaper peeling away to reveal something monstrous underneath. Who was the UserIH in that room? And if that wasn't me, then who was this user I standing amidst the desolation of the logging camp? Event. A sudden, overwhelming compulsion seized me. My gaze snapped to a collapsed wooden shack nearby, its roof caved in, walls leaning at impossible angles. An urgent, silent command pulsed through my thoughts. Go there, see what waits. I tried to resist. I wanted to turn, to flee, to seek something familiar, something that anchored me to my own reality. But my feet moved without my conscious instruction. One step, then another. My legs felt like pistons, driven by an invisible force. My hands, the ones that had felt so unfamiliar moments ago, reached out, pushing aside a tangled mess of thorny bushes that blocked the path. A splinter bit into my thumb, a sharp, grounding pain, but even that felt distant, observed rather than experienced. I was inside the shack. The air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. A single, warped wooden plank lay across two fallen beams, forming a crude bench. On it, partially covered by cobwebs, was a faded, weathered photograph. It showed a group of men, burly and smiling, standing proudly in front of a newly felled giant tree. Their faces were blurry with age, but one man in the center. His eyes, even in the faded print, seemed to bore into mine. I stared at the photograph, my breath catching in my throat. My reflection, distorted and fragmented, stared back from a broken shard of glass embedded in the wall behind the bench. But it wasn't just my reflection. For a terrifying, lucid second, the image rippled, and the face in the glass wasn't mine at all. It was the face from the photograph, the man with the unsettling eyes, superimposed over my own features, his smile stretching wider, until it was a grotesque, silent laugh. Then it was gone, and only my own gaunt, haunted face stared back. My heart didn't pound, it simply stopped, then resumed with a weak, irregular flutter. Was I UserIH? Or was I merely a vessel, a temporary dwelling for something that had been here long before me, something that had merely waited for the right signal, the right frequency to reclaim its place? My own existence felt like a borrowed coat, ill-fitting and smelling faintly of another. Above me, skeletal remains of towering pines clawed at a bruised sky. Their uppermost branches snapped clean off, leaving jagged splinters like broken teeth. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. The air was thick with the scent of decay and damp earth, mixed with something acrid, metallic, the ghost of old engine oil. I was in the abandoned logging camp, no doubt about it. Rusting hulks of machinery, half swallowed by encroaching undergrowth, dotted the clearing. A collapsed saw shack leaned precariously, its corrugated tin roof peeled back like a sardine can. I remembered stumbling here, running from. What? The memory was a frayed edge, sharp but indistinct. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the silence. The silence wasn't quite silent. It was a pressure, a hum just beneath the threshold of hearing, like a vast, unseen engine idling. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my vision. A shadow detached itself from the side of a decrepit cabin, impossibly long, stretching against the sunless sky, then snapped back, faster than any natural light shift. My breath caught. I rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, the cabin's corner seemed to recede, pulling inward, then snapping back to a normal angle. Just fatigue, I told myself, a trick of the light and my still reeling mind. But the unease coiled tighter in my gut. I needed to get back. Back to my own space, to my equipment, to the one thing that still felt like a tether to sanity, the signal. It was a desperate, illogical urge, like an addict craving the very poison that destroys them. But the idea of abandoning it, of letting it continue its insidious work unchecked, was worse. I had to understand, I had to stop it, or perhaps I had to finally fall into its embrace just to know what lay on the other side. The drive back was a blur of distorted landscapes. The familiar highway signs seemed to writhe, their letters elongating, then shrinking, only to snap back to normal just as I focused. I gripped the steering wheel, gripped tight, forcing myself to concentrate, to ignore the periphery of my vision where impossible shapes flickered. My home, when I finally reached it, was not my home. The front door, usually a solid oak slab, appeared to ripple, its grain shifting like water. I pushed it open, stepping into a space that felt both intimately mine and utterly alien. The hallway stretched too long, the ceiling too high. My living room, typically a comforting mess of books and half-finished projects, now felt like a stage set, subtly wrong. The armchair I'd bought years ago seemed to swell and contract, its fabric breathing. The framed prints on the wall, benign landscapes, now held impossible depths, their skies a sickly, vibrant purple I'd never seen before. This was it, the bleed. The signal wasn't just in the data anymore. It was in the air I breathed, the walls that enclosed me. It was here. I walked past the shifting furniture, past the breathing walls, into my study. The server rack hummed, a grounding sound amidst the chaos. I ignored the faint, shimmering distortions in the air around the monitors. This wasn't about analysis anymore. This was about confrontation. I pulled out a forgotten piece of old telemetry hardware, a relic from a previous project, and began to modify it, not to receive but to interface, to transmit. It was a crude, desperate measure, born of a mind teetering on the brink. My hands moved with a strange, feverish precision, splicing wires, recalibrating frequencies, overriding safety protocols. I wasn't sure if I was trying to send a message, or simply open a direct channel, a conduit for the entity to finally manifest fully. All I knew was that I couldn't endure this slow, agonizing erosion of reality any longer. I needed to look it in the eye, or what passed for its eye. Hours later, the modified console glowed with an eerie, unstable light. My reflection stared back from the screen, gaunt and wild-eyed. I took a deep, shuddering breath. The final plunge. I hit the activation sequence. The hum in the room intensified, no longer beneath the threshold of hearing, but a full, resonating chord that vibrated in my teeth, my bones. The air around me grew thick, heavy like breathing liquid. Colors flared, impossible hues that burned behind my eyes, a spectrum beyond human comprehension, shifting and swirling like an oil slick on an infinite ocean. My study dissolved. The walls, the ceiling, the floor all melted into the swirling, impossible colors. Non-human forms flickered at the edge of my vision, not solid, not distinct, but fleeting impressions of vast, multi-limbed things that bent light and space, their movements like the unfolding of a geometry that was utterly wrong. They weren't looking at me. They were looking through me at something beyond, something I was only a brief, irritating obstruction to. And then, the reveal. It wasn't transmitting information. It wasn't even communicating in any way I understood. It was being. And its existence, its very presence across unimaginable distances, was an act of constant, indifferent redefinition. It wasn't hostile in the way a predator was hostile. It was hostile in the way a mountain was hostile to an ant, simply by being too vast, too absolute. Its nature was to overwrite, to absorb, to become the reality of anything that perceived it. My mind wasn't unraveling. It was being rethreaded into a tapestry woven by something utterly alien, something that didn't care for human concepts of sanity or existence. The signal wasn't a message. It was a solvent, and I was dissolving. Above me, skeletal pines clawed at a bruised, indifferent sky, their branches stripped bare, like the bones of some colossal, forgotten beast. This was the abandoned logging camp then, the name whispered in my mind, a cold, hard fact amidst the swirling fog. I pushed myself up, every muscle screaming in protest. My clothes were damp, clinging to me with the chill of the forest floor. The air here was thick with the scent of decaying wood and damp earth, a heavy, cloying perfume that seemed to seep into my very pores. All around me, the camp lay in a state of advanced dereliction. Crumbling log cabins, their roofs caved in like broken skulls, dotted the clearing. Rusted saws, too heavy to salvage, lay half buried in the undergrowth, glinting dully like forgotten teeth. A hulking, skeletal frame of what must have been a saw carriage stood silent sentinel, its gears frozen in a permanent grimace. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the ground beneath my feet. It wasn't an earthquake. It was something else, something internal, a resonance that vibrated deep within my skull. The signal. It was here or I was it. The distinction had become impossibly blurred. I stumbled towards one of the more intact cabins, my hand instinctively reaching out to brace myself against a wall of rotting timber. My fingers sank into the soft, pulpy wood, leaving faint indentations. It felt less like solid matter and more like a decaying illusion. Inside, the cabin was a ruin of shattered glass and splintered furniture. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the gaps in the collapsed roof. I found a broken stool, tipped it upright, and sat, or rather slumped onto it. My eyes scanned the room, trying to anchor myself in something real, something solid. But even as I looked, the edges of things seemed to waver. A discarded tin cup on the floor shimmered, its metallic sheen momentarily replaced by a dull, organic gleam like polished bone before snapping back. My breath hitched. This wasn't just my mind playing tricks anymore. This was a direct, undeniable manipulation. The signal wasn't just transmitting information, it was altering perception. My perception. I squeezed my eyes shut trying to clear the static, but the internal hum only intensified, a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through my teeth. When I opened them again, the cabin felt different, not just old and decaying, but wrong. The shadows were too deep, too hungry. The silence was too profound, too absolute. I had dismissed it as noise, then as an unknown phenomenon. But it wasn't noise. It was a language, yes, but not one meant for communication. It was a command, a program. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The signal wasn't merely an entity transmitting information about the cosmos. It was a force within the cosmos, one that viewed the universe not as a fixed reality, but as a malleable canvas and consciousness. My consciousness. That was merely another medium to be reshaped, another pigment in its horrifying palette. It wasn't observing, it was consuming, it was feeding. The images flashed in my mind not as memories but as direct, terrifying insights. They were the process. It was a parasitic intelligence not seeking to communicate but to inhabit, to rewrite. The cosmos wasn't just vast and indifferent. That was a comforting lie. It was actively hostile, teeming with forces that redefined existence in ways that shattered human understanding. And I, UserIH, with my insatiable curiosity, had stumbled into its maw. I had invited it in. My eyes, fixed on the shimmering, unstable wall of the cabin, no longer saw decay, they saw potential. The rotten wood, the rusted metal, reality itself around me seemed to pulse with a new, terrible energy. My thoughts were no longer my own. They were echoes in a larger, incomprehensible chamber. The signal wasn't outside me anymore. It was me. And I, in turn, was now a vessel, an aperture through which its alien perception could finally gaze upon this pitiful, fragile world. The ultimate understanding was not liberation, it was surrender. It had always been here. Above me, skeletal pines clawed at a bruised, indifferent sky, their bark peeling like ancient skin. The air tasted of decay and damp soil, a heavy, cloying scent that made my stomach churn. Every joint felt stiff, as if I'd been lying there for days. The abandoned logging camp stretched around me, a graveyard of forgotten industry. Rusting machinery, immense and broken, lay half-buried in the undergrowth, a colossal saw blade, a collapsed crane arm draped in moss, the skeletal remains of what might have been a processing shed. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the rasp of my own ragged breathing and the distant, unsettling whisper of the wind through the dead trees. Where was the anomaly? It wasn't a question I asked with words, but with a deep internal tremor. It was no longer something I sought through screens or data streams. It was here. In the air, in the vibrating earth, in the very core of my skull. It wasn't a signal to be analyzed, it was a presence. My vision blurred, then sharpened, colors shifting, edges wavering. The world wasn't right. The pine needles under my hand seemed to writhe, not with insects, but with a subtle internal motion, a pattern I couldn't quite grasp. The bark of the trees pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible light. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it away, but when I opened them, the effect was stronger. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up my throat, but it felt distant, like a memory of an emotion, not the emotion itself. My determination, once a burning ember, had become something else entirely. A strange, compelling curiosity. I had to see. I had to understand. I staggered to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me. Each step was a conscious effort, yet I was drawn forward, deeper into the camp. The old logging road, now just a faint track choked with weeds, led past a series of dilapidated cabins. As I neared the first cabin, the humming intensified. It wasn't sound, not truly. It was a vibration that resonated directly within my bones, bypassing my ears entirely. It felt like my very atoms were being rearranged subtly, almost imperceptibly, to match a new frequency. And with that vibration came images, not projected onto my retina but conjured directly within my mind. Geometric forms, impossibly complex, shifting and evolving with a terrifying grace. They weren't just shapes, they were concepts, ideas, entire universes of meaning compressed into a single, crystalline flicker. I stumbled, catching myself on a rotting doorframe. The wood felt strangely alive under my touch, its fibrous structure seeming to rearrange itself into familiar, yet alien patterns. The air shimmered and the skeletal trees outside the broken window began to dance, not with the wind, but with an internal rhythm, their branches weaving together into impossible fractal designs. The anomaly wasn't just transmitting, it was altering. It wasn't merely observed, it was the observer. This was the terrifying reveal. Not a message, but a metamorphosis. It wasn't about what it was, but what I was becoming. The lines were blurring, not between objective reality and subjective nightmare, but between UserIH and something else. My thoughts, once my own, were now permeated by these alien concepts, these impossible geometries. My memories felt like echoes in a vast, echoing chamber, losing their resonance, fading into the overwhelming presence of the entity. A deep, resonant thrum vibrated through the entire camp, originating from somewhere beneath my feet. The ground trembled. Dust rained down from the cabin's sagging ceiling. I felt a pull, an irresistible urge to descend to find the source. But it wasn't a physical pull, it was a mental one. My mind was being drawn, stretched, thinned, until it was no longer a distinct entity, but a porous membrane, allowing the entity to seep in, to infuse every neuron, every synapse. I collapsed to my knees, not out of weakness, but because the very concept of standing, of having a distinct physical form, felt irrelevant. My eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering through the broken roof. But I wasn't seeing dust. I was seeing the fundamental weave of reality, the intricate, pulsating network that underpinned everything, a network that was now inextricably linked to the anomaly. The cosmos was not indifferent. It was actively hostile, not with fire and fury, but with an insidious, overwhelming presence that simply rewrote I. It didn't destroy, it absorbed. It didn't kill, it transformed. My past, my life, my data analysis, my search for understanding, it was all being swept away, replaced by something vast, ancient, and utterly incomprehensible. I was no longer UserIH. I was a vessel, a conduit, a new lens through which the entity could perceive this particular corner of reality. The humming reached a crescendo, not in my ears, but in the very core of my shattered consciousness. It wasn't painful, it was complete, a profound, terrifying sense of belonging. My identity, my ego, my fear, they dissolved like sugar in water. My body lay slumped in the abandoned logging camp, an empty shell. But my perception, my awareness, was no longer confined. It was vast, expanding, interwoven with the impossible geometries, the shifting concepts. I saw the world, but not as UserIH. I saw it as it saw it. A world of intricate patterns, of resonant frequencies, of endless, evolving information. The horror was not resolved. It had simply become.